Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible teaching service, Ebenezer tonight. Thank you all for coming out. To a good crowd of you out tonight. We've got Derek Malcolm here to give us our message tonight, but before that, we're going to open with a couple of hymns. So if I could ask the singers to come up, we're going to start with Jesus, be the center, be my source, be my light. So if we could stand after the introduction to sing. Thank you. Jesus, we enthrone you. Claim your king. Sing after introduction. Thank you. On Sunday evening to be in your presence and to hear from your words and to learn from it and to really ingrain it in our lives. Pray for Derek as he comes and gives his message that would really challenge us and give us something to work with in our day-to-day lives as Christians. Pray for every head bowed here that we take something away from it and bless us going into this week. In your son's name, amen. The announcements are just going up. Not too many changes. Food for thought tomorrow. I need to pray for that work at 10:30. There we go. We've got the prayer meeting at 7:30 on Wednesday. If you're able to make that, then please do. The ladies' Bible study is on a Thursday at 7:30. So if you're eligible to go to that, I'm sure that'd be appreciated. And there's no toddlers on this week, on the Friday, unlike what it says in the slides. As I said, we've got Derek Malcolm tonight. We're grateful for Derek coming, and look forward to what he's going to share with us in a minute. And then next week, we've got Albert McQueenie for the family service, but with no Bible teaching for the holiday weekend. So just before I hand over to Derek, we're just going to sing one last song, which is I Am Weak, But Thou Art Strong. We'll just keep our seats for this one. I'll just make it up as I go along.
It's really nice to be with you this evening. Do you know, I was just thinking, that there are not that many churches these days that have an evening service. I mean, including our own. And it's just really nice to be at church on a Sunday evening. So it's great to be here. What I thought I'd do this evening is talk a little bit about the faithfulness of God. You can see up here, if you do have a Bible or you have a device with you and you want to turn to Joshua 23, And what I thought we'd do is just really go through that chapter together, but the theme being, God's faithfulness. Now, I know that we sort of say, well, okay, right, we know about God's faithfulness and so on, but I think that is something that we do need to be reminded of every now and again. And, when we talk about God and we talk about his attributes and we talk about his character, I don't think we can talk about that enough. And I think throughout our Christian lives, we need to understand, regularly remind ourselves who God is, what he's like, and how wonderful he is. And we're going to see some of that in the passage tonight. So, at long last, just a little bit of background before we read. At long last, God's promise of the land to his people is fulfilled. Now, this was long promised in Genesis 12 and 1 to Abraham. Just coming up here, we'll see that Abram was promised in Genesis 12 and 1. The Lord has said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I'll show you." Way back, Genesis 12. And then moving on to Genesis 26, on our next slide, God promises the same to Isaac. "For to you and to your descendants I'll give all these lands, and I will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham." And then moving on to Jacob in Genesis 28, verses 13 and 14. "And God said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're now lying." And then, of course, right through to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. "I've come down to rescue my people from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of this land into a good and spacious land, flowing with milk and honey." And we actually see here in Joshua, in chapters 15 to 22, we see each of Israel's tribes being allotted their land. And so, it's all done. All done. Well, actually, not quite all done. Still a lot to be done. But Israel is now in the land, in the promised land. And God has fought for them. And, of course, they'd experienced this. And so we've got his faithfulness and his presence as he had strengthened and empowered his people, and God had enabled them to defeat the armies that were often very much stronger than they were. And so now we've got Joshua. We've got their leader, who was an old man by now, and he knew that his end was near. And he wanted to leave some words of incredible importance to God's people. It's really a bit like a last will and testament that Joshua was leaving. And I was just thinking to myself, if we were nearing the end of our lives and we had the opportunity to say some words to our loved ones, what would we say? And this is what Joshua leaves to the people of God as they were newly in the land. Now, what did Joshua say to the leaders of the people of Israel? Well, more than anything, I think that Joshua wanted to emphasize the sheer uniqueness of the God whom they worshipped. God had been utterly faithful to them in his promises, both of blessing for obedience and actually judgment for disobedience as well. And just as God has been, is now, and always will continue to be faithful to his people, so, of course, must his people be faithful to him. And so we're going to read together the first headings up, and we're going to read the first 5 verses. And we're just going to be talking about a faithful God in Israel's past. So I'm just going to read the first 5 verses. Joshua 23 and verse 1. And after a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials. And he said to them, I'm very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted an inheritance for your tribes, all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea and to the west. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land, as the Lord your God promised you. And so we've got this here, a faithful God in the past. And verses 1 and 2, Joshua is a real realist. He's getting old. Actually, in the ministry that I'm involved in, I don't mind people knowing my age, as long as they tell me that I don't look that age. But I'm 65 now, and the ministry that I'm involved in, the Turkish publishing ministry, a couple of trustees, I hear them sort of whispering almost in my hearing, phrases like exit strategy, things like that, time to pass on the baton. And this is Joshua, and he says, look, I'm getting an old man now, and he's a realist. He knows he can't continue forever. But his age and his experience of God and God's faithfulness means that he can testify to God's faithfulness to him and to God's people over a long period of time. There is, there's a wonderful thing about being young, and you've got the energy and you've got the commitment, and you feel as though you can sort of take on the world. And when you're older, and I can sort of say this now, you have built up a kind of bank of experience that younger folks don't have, because they haven't lived that length of time. And here's Joshua, and he's saying, I'm getting older now, but hey, I have experienced God's faithfulness, and I want to testify to it. And this is what he's doing here. And although Joshua, he describes in verse 4 how he allotted the various tribes their land and how he conquered the peoples of the land to bring Israel into its inheritance. But first and foremost, we're just going to look at verse 3 on the screen here. First and foremost, it wasn't Joshua who'd achieved all this. It was God himself who did it through Joshua. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. And also, in verse 5, a similar thing. We'll have verse 5 come out here. We see that God did it, and God will do it. Who conquered the land? Well, Israel did it, ably led by Joshua. But ultimately, who really did it? God himself did it. And so we can see Joshua just talking about the faithfulness of God. And the events of chapters 3 to 11 of Joshua describe how God enabled the Israelites to defeat Jericho, to defeat Ai, and then the various kind of hostile alliances that came against them. God helped them to defeat these. And God's people should never forget that God had been faithful to them. And here's a challenge to us tonight, looking back over our lives. Whether we're young and haven't been believers for all that long, even already, we will have experienced God's faithfulness. When we are older, if we've been walking with the Lord and allowed him to have dealings in our lives, we have seen that God has been faithful. And I just think, of all the different ways that God has been faithful to me. I remember when you'll excuse some of the examples from Turkey, but when we moved to Istanbul at first, I have never been a linguist at all. Coming from Stenhousemuir, originally we were never exposed to many more languages. And I remember in the French class at Larwood High School, in first year at high school, we all got French. And halfway through the year, the head French teacher, came through the class, and he carried out what can only be described as a cull. And he said, you and you and you and you'll never be good at languages, so we're going to move you to the metalwork room. And it wasn't that I was good at metalwork, but anyway. But I was about 12 then, and that phrase must have stuck in my mind. You'll never be good at languages. And so when, eventually after a long period of time, of course, the Lord called us to Turkey, went over to Istanbul and started to learn Turkish. And I struggled and struggled and struggled. In the first couple of years, really could hardly still, make progress. And then we came back for our first furlough and the birth of our second child. And then the church in London, one of our commending churches, before we went out again, they prayed for us. And they said, is there anything really, really specific? I said, please pray that I will somehow or other get this Turkish language. And the elders out the front, they, prayed for us, prayed for Heidi and me, for David at that time and Esther, and prayed that if there was some kind of blockage, that the Lord would remove that. And I actually felt at that time something almost happen in my mind, a shift almost. And when we went back out to Istanbul, I wasn't turned into a sort of great linguist or anything like that. But what had happened is the prayer of the elders had been answered, and my fear of learning the language had gone. And then I remember the very first time rather than teaching through translation, and someone really nudged me and said, you really got to do it now in Turkish. And it was like standing on one of these high dive boards and getting ready to plunge into the water, not very sure if you can even swim, and wonder what would happen. And with God's help and strength, I left the diving board, plunged in, and I think struggled about for a bit, and then the Turkish started to come out. And I realized after, I'd finished, that I'd actually delivered my first talk in Turkish to Turkish believers. And I just see God's utter faithfulness in these things. When we're really weak, it's then that he is strong, and we have to give him the credit for that. So how has God been faithful in your life? And do we give God thanks for that? Do we still remember that? Or do we forget it and move on? And so God is faithful. Let's move on to point 2. And it's verses 23, chapter 23, verses 6 to 8. A faithful God for the present. This monitor has just gone off, but can this go on again? Or is it... It's just gone blank. But anyway, so a faithful God for the present. And we'll read verses 6 to 8 together. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Don't associate with those nations that remain among you. Don't invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You mustn't serve them or bow down to them, but you're to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done until now. That's good. It's all back again. Thanks. So here we go. A faithful God for the present. Now, we need to note the exhortations. Be strong. Be careful to obey. These are exhortations for the present. And so we find out who God is, what God is like from his revelation to us in the Bible. And Israel already had the books of Moses. We can see that here. These first 5 books of the Bible, the law of Moses, Joshua says. And in these writings there was plenty to learn about God's faithfulness, plenty to see what God was like, how he is holy, how he's pure, how he's free from corruption, free from injustice and from evil, and free from lying and cheating, a God who could be utterly trusted. And moving on to the next slide here, and this is a path, and you know, they weren't to turn aside to other paths and to other gods. And Heidi was saying some of our church ladies went on a weekend away to Arran in January, and they'd all gone a walk away up this hillside and through this forest, and then coming back down in the afternoon. It was getting dark, obviously, in January. It gets dark early. And then they kind of lost where the path was, and there's that feeling of disorientation when you don't know exactly where the path leads, where you're going, if you can find the path. And I remember once, many years ago, I was just a lad of about 19 or 20, and I used to go down to Machermore to Newton Stewart to work in the summer at the Christian Eventide home down there. And I got the train down to Bar Hill, and due to a miscommunication, no one was there to meet me. And this is about 10 o'clock in the evening. So I just walked down from Bar Hill, and then I walked the 21 miles to Newton Stewart. It took me all night. I had to walk all night. And not a car passed me. It's just, you know, in these country places, things just closed down, I think, about 6 o'clock. And it was so dark, because sometimes there was forest on one side and forest on the other, that I was walking along the white lines. And when one white line ended, I could just about see where the other white line began. That's how dark it was. And and you know, in many ways, just thinking about Psalm 119 and verse 105, we're just going to see that on the screen. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And Joshua is saying, you know, follow God, follow the Lord. Don't deviate into other things. In verse 8, they were to hold fast, that is, to really cling to God. Their knowledge of God from the scriptures was not just to be head knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with head knowledge and with intellectual knowledge. And that's a great thing. But it had also to be heart knowledge. It had to work its way down. It had to penetrate and permeate our lives and percolate so that it shapes our thinking, our knowledge of God and who he is, what he's like. It permeates and shapes our thinking, our conscience, our lifestyle, our behavior, and our values. So we live a life that reflects God's holiness, holding fast to him. Because the thing is, as verse 7 says, not to hold fast to God would generally mean that God's people would be holding fast to something else. The false, man-made gods of the surrounding nations in Joshua's time. The archaeologists, of course, have discovered all kinds of stuff about Canaanite life and Canaanite religion in these days. And, well, there were male and female religious prostitution in the pagan temples all around. There was pedophilia as standard in society. There was deep superstition, child sacrifice, and a whole lot more was just normal in Canaanite society. And I tell you what's frightening, I find, about our society today, that there are things that people are pushing to normalize that are not normal. And we need to be careful. We need to be making sure that our values are shaped and formed by the teaching of the Scripture. So to hold fast to God, to cling to God, we must do that today as our society becomes more and more pagan. And we've been in a period now of what I think I could say is moral anarchy. And we'll think of the gender issues and things like that as well. We need to, as believers, be clear thinking and be informed by the teaching of Scripture. Moving on to our third main point, chapter 23, verses 9 to 11. Faithful God, and a challenge to respond. Let's read together verses 9 to 11. The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations, and to this day no one has been able to withstand you. One of you routs 1,000 because the Lord your God fights for you just as he promised. So be very careful to love the Lord your God. And so here's this challenge to respond. Yes, they had fought, and yes, they had won battles, but it was God who did it, and therefore love God. And so this coming up in our screen, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, this first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And God had already shown his love for his people through his untiring faithfulness. Therefore, should we not then love him to the exclusion of all other gods and ideologies? And of course, we just remind ourselves of the cross and what God did for us through his incarnate Son and that atoning sacrifice on the cross, so that we sinful people might be forgiven and have a relationship with the living God. Then moving on to our fourth main point, verses 12 and 13, a faithful God and a solemn warning. Let's read verses 12 and 13 together. But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they'll become snares and traps for you, whips on your back and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. And so we've got a bit of a kind of warning here, quite a serious warning. If God's people willfully turn away from God, and if they choose a different path, and then there was going to be inevitable consequences. If the people of God, if they choose to align with the remaining people of the land and all their practices and all their gods and so on, then what will happen is they'll become like them. And being faithful to God results in receiving his blessings. Choosing to reject God and submit to other gods will mean coming under God's judgment. And just thinking about the second half of Romans chapter 18, and just the indictment on society in Paul's day in first century Rome and the first century Roman world. And actually it just strikes so similar a chord with our society today. And we do live in a godless society with a value that people place on human life, and that is life that bears God's image, life that has been created and made in the image of God, and yet that life is being devalued and often discarded. The murder of the unborn, the legislation continually being pushed in our parliaments to allow the killing of the elderly, and the utter inability of many of our politicians to even define what a woman is. It just means that we're hurtling towards a pagan, godless society with scant regard for human life. And and Canaanite religion and culture was like that. That's what they were. That's what they were living around. And this is what Joshua was saying: have nothing to do with it. And then moving on then to our fifth point, verses 14 to 16. A faithful God in blessing and in judgment. Verses 14 to 16. And now Joshua says, I'm about to go to the way of the earth, go the way of the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. But just as all the good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so he will bring on you all the evil things he's threatened until the Lord your God has destroyed you from this good land he has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you. God's people can never say that they weren't warned. And so Joshua now rounds off his last will and testament with the same serious words. And it reminds God's people that every one of God's promises to date have been fulfilled. Let's just look at the next slide together, where, again, not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. What an incredible record of God's faithfulness and Joshua's testimony to that. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one failed. Deliverance from Egyptian slavery. Tick that one off. In the desert, protection, food, water, guidance. Tick that one off. The promised land and victory. Tick that one off. They're in the promised land. And we can see God's faithfulness. And so Joshua is reminding the people of God that there were conditions. There were rights and privileges. And, and we also have rights and conditions. Just to look at the next slide here. And this is one that I saw on a school notice board. And you can, it's a little bit faint, but on our left here, that big thing on the left there, it says on the school notice board, rights do not have to be earned or come with responsibilities. They are unconditional. Now that is nonsense. That is absolute rubbish. And it's on a school notice board in Lanarkshire, in a school near you. And that's the kind of stuff that our young people are being fed today. Meaningless and sometimes untruthful sound bites. Responsibilities. Yeah, conditions and responsibilities come together. And everywhere where there are privileges, these privileges carry responsibilities. I'll give you an example. Our David, he lives in London and he won't be listening to this. So, but when he was 16, he how could I put it? He was a challenging 16-year-old. Would you say that, Heidi? Yeah, particularly towards his mum. And he, his room, my mother would describe it as a midden. And he wouldn't do anything around the house. And we always felt very, a very close family involved with each other. There was Heidi and me, there was David, Esther and Lauren, all lived under the same roof, all got the same benefits, and, we all got fed and all, electricity, gas, heating, whatnot. David had the second biggest room in the house. He was the oldest of the siblings and so on. And actually, he really had a pretty good number. He wouldn't clean his room. He wouldn't take a turn to do the dishes. He wouldn't take the rubbish out. He wouldn't clean the car when it was his turn to do that. No, too busy with studies, this kind of stuff. And so I remember I wrote out this sheet of paper and I entitled it David's Community Contribution, because I wanted them to understand that he was part of a little community, the Malcolm community. And I said, now, David, every week, these are your duties. But the thing is, I don't want you to feel, David, that if you really genuinely don't have time to do these duties, you're getting free gas, free electric, free heating, free food, free water, free bed, free lodgings, all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, if you're not able to do these duties, don't worry, because you can choose option B, which was £20 a week. Oh, I've always found with David, financial sanctions. Oh, even when he was a boy, 8 years old, and he started to get pocket money, and he did something wrong, something quite serious that warranted 2 weeks without pocket money, he said, I'd rather have a smack. But you see, the thing is, there are consequences. If we have privileges, we also have responsibilities. And that's true throughout life. And why should we think that we can have God's faithfulness and God's love and God's protection and God's help and all automatically sort of on the cheap? And it's amazing that a lot of people today seem to have an idea of God that is actually nothing more than an all-loving, fuzzy, hazy Santa Claus type figure who gives everything and demands nothing from his people. Far be it that our chosen lifestyles be impacted, or our values be challenged, or our behavior and our attitudes be impacted by God. But you see, God's faithfulness is seen in blessing to those who love him, who follow him, and who reflect his holiness in their lives, and judgment to those who choose not to. Oh, but that's not fair. Maybe we're thinking, why should God's people have such moral demands? But I was just thinking, pretty much every club and society and organization in existence has got a list of privileges and responsibilities. And it would be kind of strange if they didn't. And you know what I did? We live in Burnside and Rutherglen. I went on to Rutherglen Bowling Club website and I thought, I'm going to have a look at the club rules. And there's a list of benefits for its members, quite a long list of benefits. And then here is followed by a list of responsibilities. And you can see some of these responsibilities there. What's number 5 there? Respect the rights and the dignity of worth of all participants, all that kind of stuff. But these are serious responsibilities. And then it's followed, let's move on, by a list of consequences for those who refuse to follow the rules. Be prepared to, required to apologize and or be dropped. Imagine being dropped or substituted from the local bowling club. The shame of it. Or suspended, or be required to leave the club. You see, there are privileges and there are responsibilities at Rutherglen Bowling Club, and if these aren't taken seriously, then there are consequences. So how much more when we're dealing with the living God? And so many people seem to have their Christianity on the cheap. And so, why should we think that it should be different? When we're dealing with the creator of the universe, the sustainer of the world, the one who flung stars into space, and the one who created and who sustains life. And he's wonderful. He's very great. He's sinless. He's holy. He's perfect. He's love. He is faithful. And he is just. And obedience to God and following him brings blessing. And willful disobedience and choosing other gods or their ideologies ultimately means judgment. Because God is faithful. And so it's very sad that Israel did run after other gods and was ultimately and forcefully removed from the promised land, taken into exile. And yet, even then, God remained faithful with a remnant. And when Israel repented, just like Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, God brought them back. So, an application to us, what does all this mean to our lives today? Do we love God with all our hearts, the faithful one? How faithful are we to him? To what extent do our lives show the distinctiveness of following a God who is holy? How are we different from those around us? To what extent are we salt of the earth and light of the world? As Jesus taught, we should be. And this is a massive challenge to us in our generation. So just going on to the summary slide. So faithful God, faithful in their past, faithful for the present, then a challenge for God's people to respond, and then with a solemn warning, and then blessing, and then judgment. And then one final verse with which we will close. Let us hold unswervingly, the writer to the Hebrews says, to the hope we profess. Why? For he who promised is faithful. And what Joshua, his last will and testament, what did he want to leave with the people? The faithfulness of God. And God was faithful then, he's been faithful through the ages, and he is faithful today to us in our own generation. And the challenge is for us to be faithful to him. And we can be with his help and his strength. Let's just pray together. Father, we thank you that we can come together and take time and to look into your word. We thank you for these godly examples of your servants of long ago. And we just think how they stand out as great examples. We think about Joshua, and we think of the challenges he had, and yet we thank you for his testimony to your faithfulness. Father, we just take time now to think if any of us here have challenges at the minute, and we just need to know your faithfulness. We need to know your help, and we need to know your nearness. And we ask, Father, that you would reassure us again of your faithfulness, because we know that you are a faithful God. We give thanks in his name. Amen.
We're just going to change that last song, following Derek's message there, to Faithful One, Song Changing. If you just change the words. Thank you. So Faithful One, Song Changing, 8-1, Morocco piece, which was we've just heard from Derek. Close the service with this, so we can stand to sing after the introduction.